Hi, good evening, and welcome to On Being Good, a conversation with the Good Place Philosophers. My name is Elizabeth Nearing. I'm the curator of ideas programs for the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we call home, Connecticut. We hope that wherever you are, you can take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you are on and the history of the place you are in. You can find out more about Native land near you at nativeland.ca and look at what tribes have lived in your area. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands with Black Lives Matter and with countless citizens in our own city and across the country who are exercising their right to protest the systemic racism at the root of police violence. The festival stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. And tonight, this year, our Ideas programming has been created in collaboration with abundance of our neighbors, thought partners, organizations who've helped us think about what we want to talk about when we talk about democracy. And we've been thinking a lot about people power. And tonight we're going to talk a lot about the moral center of democracy. What does morality and ethics look like? As we explore this topic. So as a part of the Ideas series, we've been working with Connecticut Humanities with additional major support from the Whitney Center and media support from Connecticut Public. So I want to thank everybody who's been a part of making this possible. This is our final Ideas program of the festival. And we want to continue to center your thoughts, your questions, things you're excited about. So please, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can type comments or questions on the video, and we can see it here. And we want to keep your ideas a part of this conversation. So we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. I'm extremely excited tonight to introduce you all to two professors who served as consulting philosophers on the NBC sitcom The Good Place, which some have said was surely the first in sitcom history. So Pamela Hieronymi is a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles. She's mainly known for her work in moral psychology, and you can find more information about her work on her website at UCLA. Todd May is a political philosopher who writes on topics of anarchism, post-structuralism, and post-structuralist anarchism. Most recently, he published books on existentialism and moral philosophy, and he is a professor of philosophy at Clemson University. The two of them also had the opportunity to cameo on the finale of The Good Place. So without any further ado, very excited to welcome Todd and Pamela. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us, Elizabeth.
Absolutely, it's great to be here.
So let's kick it off just with the first question I think maybe a lot of people have is, how did two philosophers get to be a part of an NBC sitcom? How did that happen? Can you tell a little bit about your Good Place story? Maybe we can start with you, Pamela.
Sure. So surprisingly, I was emailed out of the blue. I got an email from what turned out to be Mike Schur, asking saying he had an idea for a TV show, and would I happen to have time to talk with him about some of the philosophical implications. And actually, being in LA, every so often I do get emails like this, and usually they are from a student, a grad student, or somebody like that. And so, and it's usually fun to do. So I usually accept. So I said, sure, love to set up a time. And then as it was getting closer, I Googled the name of this person who'd sent me the email and found that, wow, this is the creator of Parks and Recreations. This is actually a very serious, involved television person. So that was exciting. And nonetheless, I failed to put it in my calendar. And like every absent-minded professor, I then completely forgot. So I was sitting deep in my writing process in my home office and got a call from Mike, who I had left sitting in the coffee shop for the last 45 minutes, and wondering where I was. And I apologized profusely. And went running down the 2 blocks to the coffee shop to meet him. I've since learned that he thought that this was surely the sign that he had chosen the right person, that the person who's going to forget about the TV producer and just get stuck in her own thoughts was the right person. So we talked for about 3 hours. He had already thought through pretty much the entire arc of the show. He kind of knew certainly the first season, and I suspect he had the whole thing in his head already. And he was very interested in I think he was interested in talking to me because I have on my website a description of a paper about some of the paradoxes or difficulties in trying to be a good person when you lack good motives, and whether that can be self-defeating in something like the way insomnia gets to be self-defeating, where the very effort, if the effort is motivated by bad motives, maybe it won't ever work. So he was interested in that. And so we talked about that for a while. He was also interested in this idea of the point system, which I was very much against. I was like, no, can't do points. Points is not where it's at. And so we had a great conversation. It was super fun. And then I didn't think about it until, I don't know, maybe 9 months later, driving around LA, I see these billboards for the show. And so I sent him a quick email. I said, hey, I see that must be your show that's coming out. Congratulations. I'm still working on the same dumb book. You've got a whole new television show in the can. And then he pulled me back occasionally, as the years went on, in the same sort of capacity, to have a kind of long conversation in the early stages of the season's development.
Amazing. How about you, Todd?
Well, I came on after Pamela. So it was during the first season, somewhere in the middle, that one of his writers had passed a little book I'd written on death to him. And he was reading the book on death. Actually, he told me afterwards that he was reading this book at night. And you have to picture this, Elizabeth. This is a gray book with a raven on the cover, and all it says is death, right? And he's in bed reading it, and his wife apparently crawled into bed next to him and said, I don't know that this marriage is going to survive this show. And which was odd for me, because I'm the only marriage I'm used to putting strain on is my own. So, but apparently things worked out in the marriage.
Good.
But he emailed me, and very much like Pamela, we talked for a couple of hours, and one thing sort of led to another. We've done Skyping, and like Pamela, although after her, I came into the writer's room, and we eventually, Pamela and I wound up getting called. I guess I got called, Pamela, like a week before. I don't know. Did you?
Like a week before the shoot?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Like a week before the shoot. Can you fly out to LA? I know you're busy. And I'm thinking, not that busy, right? So, yeah, I got on a flight to LA, and that was actually where I met Pamela.
Amazing.
Yeah. So that's where. So we've sort of had parallel tracks up to the point where we met.
Right. At Universal Studio, where we had adjacent rooms in the trailers that they put the talent in. We were the talent.
Yeah, we were the talent. Yeah.
If only we were live, then you could be in our dressing rooms in New Haven, and you could have your talent dressing rooms all over again. So getting to the heart of it, you're the experts that were brought into the room on the show, and this is in the central framing of this conversation. What does it mean to be good? What does that mean? Maybe we could start with you, Todd. Yeah.
Okay, so if you ask a philosopher, what does it mean to be good? You don't have the time for a response. So let me just take one angle on this, one aspect of it. So surely one aspect of being good is recognizing that there are other folks out there, right? That there are other people, and for that reason, other non-human animals, and they have lives to live. So if we just take the case with other humans, look, they're afraid of death. They want their life to be meaningful. They want to form connection with other people. They want to have a sense of their own worth. And I think one of the central aspects of morality is just recognizing that and integrating that recognition into your life. And there are, of course, different ways to do it, and different theories tell you different ways to do it. But I think fundamental to the idea of morality is that recognition that you're not the only person in the universe. There's other folks out there.
That was incredibly concise. We've got like a clip. Like now I understand goodness fully.
Yeah, don't get me started.
That's great, Pamela. What would you add to that?
Similarly, I'm going to just take a piece of the question because what it is to be good, I think, is a huge question, and one that actually we don't need to agree about. I think it's important that especially in a pluralistic society like our own, that there can be contrasting and competing ideas of what a good life or a good person is. But I tend to be interested in the much lower down question, more minimal question of what does it take to live respectfully with other people, respectfully and peacefully with other people who are sharing a world of limited resources. So that's the idea that I actually that got Mike's attention, that contrasts a bit with the points. The idea, it's presented in a book called What We Owe to Each Other, which is a contractualism, and that current philosophy book surprisingly gets all kinds of product placement in the Good Place.
It really does.
Which is amazing. But that book is about contractualism, which is a moral theory, which grows out of a political theory. But the basic idea is, look, we got to live together. We got to get along here some way. And that the moral rules, at least the minimum moral rules of respect, are the rules that we would all agree to if we thought the most important thing to do is to come to some agreement about how we're all going to live together peacefully and respectfully. And nobody has a bargaining advantage. Nobody can. We have to come to these agreements as people who are equally positioned, symmetrically positioned. So the thought is that being moral would be living according to those rules, even though we're not symmetrically positioned, even though some of us do have a bargaining advantage or can exploit other people, but we're not going to, because we respect one another as equals. We respect one another as people who we have to share this world with. So living according to those rules doesn't necessarily make you a fantastic person, but at least means you're not a jerk, right? I mean, at least means that you're respecting other people. And living according to those rules is not always easy. Sometimes it's actually extraordinarily difficult. So that's the sort of layer of morality that I'm interested in the most.
Yeah, and we're facing a really interesting moment with that exact question right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're facing a big question of collective versus individual good with COVID. And that's something that, Pamela, you had called it a rugged individualism. And that folks are really grappling with, like, oh, what makes me put on a mask, right? For other people, what, to keep the collective good safe, or what makes people not do that or fight this idea of putting on a mask or staying home or fighting for that. That is something that is like a really tangible example of this collective versus individualism. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Right. So if you're thinking of the of these minimum rules that we all have to live, constrain ourselves in accordance with in order to live respectfully together, you're going to encounter what gets called Freerider problems. So you're going to encounter cases in which we have a system of rules that they need most people to live up to them in order for it to work. But it doesn't need 100% conformity for it to work. That's why it gets called Freerider. So the subway system needs for most people to pay their fares, but it's possible for a few people to ride for free, and it's not going to make the whole system come crashing down. So when you have a system like that, which is most of the ways that we solve our collective problems together, there's reason for each person to want to be the free rider. And for each person, if just one person does it, it's not a big deal, right? And yet, not everyone can do that, right? So this is the sort of common ethical thought. What if everybody did that? To which some people want to say, well, not everybody does do that, and I'm going to do it, and that makes me special. And I think this is an idea Mike liked a lot too. The idea that a core moral failing is thinking that you're special. And in fact, that idea, which is a key idea from contractualism, a friend and colleague of mine, Aaron James, has a kind of popular book called "Assholes: A Theory," where he identifies the asshole as the person who makes the exception of themselves, thinks of themselves as entitled to be special. So as we're facing these challenges that we're facing now, and that we will face in the future about vaccines and things like that, it's tempting to want to be the person who doesn't conform, right? Who doesn't do the thing. But, everybody's got to work together. And if you're making the exception for yourself, then it's understandable that people are going to be unhappy with you and think that you think you're special. You think you're better than them, just because you don't want to have to inconvenience yourself in a way that we all are in this together. So we all need to, pull together to in this case, protect one another.
Yeah, Pamela. I mean, one thing that connects what you're saying to what you were talking about earlier with the contractuals is that I think the wearing of the masks is a good example of how contractualism might work in a very everyday way, right? I mean, I think you could state it better than I can. So rules people could reasonably check. So go with it on the masks.
Oh, right. So the very formal statement of contractualism in What We Owe to Each Other is that an action is wrong if it's in violation of a general system of, if it's in violation of principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject as a basis of informed, unforced general agreement. So that is not a concise and spiffy way of accounting for things.
But amazing that you have it memorized, though.
Yeah, not so amazing, but I do. Yeah, I do. Once I get started. So if we were all sitting around in a kind of moral constitutional convention and somebody suggests, why don't we all wear masks? Then we have to ask who can object to that on what basis, and who can object to the opposite. So who could object to a principle that requires us to wear masks, and on what basis? And the healthy and the people who are unlikely to be endangered could say, I object to it because it's inconvenient, it's uncomfortable, I don't like it. And those are good reasons. And then the people who are going to be at risk would say, well, I object to a principle that would allow people not to wear masks because it puts my life at risk. And now we have to weigh up those two grounds for rejections. We have to weigh up risks to one person's life and inconvenience to another person. And in that case, it's pretty clear, right? If we're treating everybody symmetrically, it's pretty clear what principle we would adopt. And it's the principle that would protect people's lives, even at the cost of some inconvenience to others.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and one thing to emphasize in what Pamela said is that she's not talking about a law that we should have.
Correct.
She's talking about what it means to be a morally decent person. Right. What respect involves. Right.
A minimally respectful person, like not even good. We're not going for good. We're going for minimally respectful. Right?
Yeah.
That's a low bar.
But it's hard sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and Todd, you wrote about this specifically too, about what our obligations to each other are, like in the midst of this crisis and even after it. You wrote about this in The Stone, I believe. So
Right.
what can you talk about that, and even now as folks are perceiving it to end, right? Like there's this sort of perceived ending of a curve. What is the obligation to one another from your perspective?
Yes, but we should note that with the exception of a couple of people at the very top of our government, those perceptions have changed in the last 48 hours. People who denied they're finding it a little more difficult to deny now. But I mean, the idea I was trying to press on is something that takes off a bit from what Pamela has been talking about. So let's assume that we are morally obliged to wear masks. And let's assume that among the reasons we're morally obliged to wear masks is because it protects other people. That's to say, we owe other people morally that we wear masks when we're in public. Now, one of the things that seems to imply is that in cases where everyday actions of ours can have important and deleterious effects on other people, then we need to take that into account when we are acting. So the assumption that implies we should wear masks, hey, if we're going to risk other people's health in our everyday actions, we need to think about that and try to act in accordance with doing something about it.
Okay.
That's got wider application. Once you go there, then you can begin to see that there are lots of areas outside the wearing of masks that have to do with our everyday actions having important deleterious effects on other folks. And it can be from the ways in which we treat the environment. It can be in the things that we buy. It can be in the ways we either ignore or we don't ignore other people who are vulnerable. So I think the wearing of the mask, as long as we say that that's something that has an ethical element to it, implies other things for our behavior that are worth reflecting on and looking at, both as individuals, but also as a matter of collective behavior, how we ought to participate in the kinds of changes and challenges to institutions in our society.
That's amazing. And there's something also that happens when a lot of us think like, oh, we've made this collective agreement. We've agreed we're going to wear masks. And just the other day for me, I was like, oh, I can go to a store. And I walked in a store and I saw somebody wearing their mask below their nose. And I felt this feeling of, that's not how you do it. You're doing it wrong. And just wanting to say like, no, stop it. And I was like, why am I so upset? It's this contract that I feel has been broken. And Pamela, you've spoken a little bit about this feeling of people shaming other folks for not wearing a mask or not agreeing. And the safety in that, and this is something that often comes from a place of power and privilege, right? Of saying like, I know better. I think that we've agreed on this thing. And can you talk a little bit about the impulse to do that and why it's ineffective?
So the impulse to do it, I am not a psychologist, but it does seem to me that people love, everybody wants to feel righteous. And some people like to do that at the expense of others. It's not effective, in part because everybody likes to feel righteous. So people are defensive when they are criticized or what have you. And talking to people about shaming, I kind of think shaming is never a good idea. I'm not sure what use that is, but it did occur to me that so in my own case, a while back before we had really understood, the mask thing, I was walking to the store and I had my mask in my bag, but I didn't have it on my face. My thought was I was going to put it on when I got to the store. And a guy asked me like, oh, so I guess you're not worried, across from his car, I guess you're not worried about the virus. And I was like, oh, I got my mask in my bag. But so I don't think he was shaming me. I think he was hassling me. Right. And I think that was okay. Right. I mean, I don't find that a problematic thing to have done. But that's very different than shame on you, than that kind of thing. So do we want to speak up about things? Do we want to, try to hassle a little bit, include a little bit of social pressure? Maybe, doing that's always tricky. People are touchy, but on the other hand, we're trying to, we're in a new social norm. We're trying to generate a new social norm. So that seems to be like something that's, it's always going to be tough. Like when we started wearing seatbelts, which, wasn't even for the benefit primarily of other people, but for the benefit of oneself, people were very upset about that for a long time. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was the last bit I was going to say is that one of my favorite philosophers on this kind of thing is Miss Manners, whose theory is that you should approach every interaction on the assumption that the person knows the good thing to do and has an excuse, right? Like, so even when it's not at all obvious to you what that excuse might be, you approach the conversation as though they didn't know, as though there's some good reason, which is very hard to do, but I think it's good advice.
Yeah, Todd, you're going.
Yeah, I was going to jump on this with Pamela, because I think I agree with what you're saying, but I think I may be using a different term. So, working in terms of something that I would say it's shaming, perhaps, but not humiliating, would be, say, confronting authorities with things that they are committed to. So, for instance, at Clemson, where I work, when the Muslim ban came down, the university refused to criticize it in any kind of way. And we engaged into activities. I did a week-long fast in front of the administration building with some other folks. They kept saying, well, we're not being silent. And we kept throwing silence at them, right? And all of our rallies, we were trying to align them with silence. And what I would say is shame them with their alliance with silence, although we weren't trying to humiliate them as individuals. So I suspect, Pamela, that what I'm calling shaming is what you're calling shaming, what I'm calling humiliating, are probably close cousins here. Would that be fair?
Yes, I'd have to think a little more about it. I mean, here we're philosophers, right? I'd have to think a little more about it before I sign off completely. But I do think that the difference between an individual and an institution is super important in this sort of example.
Well, and I want to call attention a little bit to one of those assumptions you talked about in contractualism about if all were equal, right? What would the rules be that we agreed on? And we know very definitely that all is not equal, right? And that we have one of our commenters, Babs, has made a comment like in talking about masks, when Black people or people of color put on a mask, there is a very different perceived impact, right? And so that, like, if the goal is collective safety, the question is whose safety and who with what power, right? is deciding what folks are doing for safety.
That's correct.
And I'm curious if either one of you would be interested in jumping in on that point. It's like, how does this fit when we know that everything is not equal?
Great. So so let me quickly then correct my little story that I was telling about our moral constitutional convention, because I ended it too quickly. I ended it with the person who said, well, it's a threat to my life. It makes me less safe if other people don't wear masks because I'm at risk for this very serious disease that we don't have any cure for at the moment. But then somebody else might say, well, actually, I'm at risk if I wear a mask because I'm a person of color in a neighborhood that, wearing a mask puts me at risk for that reason, right? To which that's a very good reason to object to the principle that requires everyone to wear a mask. And so, in fact, the moral principle, the moral rule, so to speak, is going to end up being fairly contoured. And so, I mean, all moral principles are going to be like that, not just this one. So everyone must wear a mask is a rule of thumb. And there's going to be exceptions for things like if wearing a mask puts you at serious risk, or if you have to eat, or things like that. But it was a bad oversight for me not to remember that wrinkle about the way in which mask wearing in certain contexts for certain people makes them a target.
Right. And while we're here, I think we've started to carve into and talk about goodness, and I want to talk about a little bit of the flip side. Let's talk about cruelty, because that is a part of our society too, as one of our society's great failings. I think it's Judith Sklar who said that. Am I getting that right? Mm-hmm. That the movement and the movement for Black lives right now is confronting public cruelty towards Black Americans, and how have things like mass incarceration become normalized, right? Or things like the story of stolen land been erased by a narrative of pioneers discovering land. Like, can we talk a little bit about the role of cruelty in our society, and how does that fit or contradict with this idea of collective good? And maybe, Todd, could we start with you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of the things that seems to justify cruelty is the denigration of other people, thinking of them as less than you are. To what Pamela was saying, thinking of them as something less than your equals. And once you begin to think about people like that, being cruel to them becomes an option, because they're just not where they don't feel the same things we feel. I remember ambassador under Reagan to the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick, when the US was busy slaughtering people in Nicaragua and El Salvador, saying, yes, but you have to understand that life isn't as meaningful to them as it is to us. And once you open that door, cruelty is what walks through. And so I think that, say, for instance, if we're going to come closer to the present and think about the police, right? I think for the police, it becomes easier to think of people with darker skin as somehow less than people with lighter skin. And by the way, when I say this, I mean also that there are African-American police who can also engage in the same thing. Most of the cruelty that's occurred has occurred from white police officers, but not all of it. But I think the common denominator is people feeling that somebody is less than you are, and therefore it's okay to treat them in ways, right, that by any reasonable recognition is cruel. And if we take one more step with that, right, one of the reasons I think that the president is comfortable treating people cruelly, and I think some of the things he says and does are, I don't know how you describe them as in terms of anything other than cruel, is that he does not think of others as anywhere equal to him. Therefore, other people can be treated, right, in cruel ways because they are not who he is. So I think once you open that door to inequality, you're really asking for the possibility of cruelty.
That inequality itself is what leaves space for cruelty.
Yeah, I think it does, right? And of course, there's so many ways in which we do it. The police do it with African Americans. The president does it regularly with women. Says things that I shudder when I think about some of the things that he's tweeted out. But it's all rooted in this idea of I've got license because this person is less than equal. Right. Which, by the way, goes back to speak to some of the importance of what Pamela was talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Pamela, you look like you're on the cusp of something?
I got some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm ready.
So I guess I as often do, I want to make a distinction, or I want to pull apart some different ideas. So when someone says cruelty, the first thing I think of is a kind of standard definition of taking pleasure in another's pain. And that's a thing that happens, that kind of sadism. But that seems to me, it seems to me that people can be cruel in the way that I think, Todd, you were just talking about, without that, right? So where what you're talking about is more sort of just failing to recognize the full reality of another person, and carrying on as though they're less than you, as though they're not important, or even just as though. So one of the things that I think a lot about and write a lot about is moral failure and reactions to moral failure, which in the philosophical discussion goes under the label blame, which is not a great label for it. But it seems to me that there are two different things that go on in moral failing, and that when the difference isn't recognized, you get the kind of cruelty that I think Todd is talking about. So, and I think it's happening a lot in our country at this point. So one kind of thing that goes on is what I think of as the blame game. So something's gone wrong, and we're trying to figure out who's to blame and who needs to fix it. And in my life, the go-to example of this is a lecture course that's going badly. So it's going badly, and the instructor is going to think that is because it's the students' fault. They are not showing up prepared. They're on their devices. They're distracted. They're the source of the problem. They need to fix it. The students are, of course, going to think it's the instructor's fault, and the instructor's boring and monotone. And so we have this kind of power struggle about who needs to fix this problem that's making everybody uncomfortable. But that kind of blame game, you can engage in that without ever questioning whether anybody's respecting anybody else, whether anybody's done anything wrong. It's just, we're just in this kind of power struggle about, who's got to do the fixing here. Whereas a completely different thing happens when one person or group of people just ignores the pressing needs and interests of another. So, and that's what we're seeing with that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to bring to our attention, that the dignity and needs, like, people matter here, and they're being ignored, right? And when when the response to that is to engage it as though it's the blame game, as though it's like we just have to struggle about, like, no, it's your fault, no, it's your fault. That feels very cruel to me, I think, in the sense that Todd's talking about. It's not that anybody is taking pleasure in another's pain. It's that you're not even listening to the very pressing real needs and pain of another human being. And instead, you're engaged in sort of protecting your own interests, right? And so that, it's interesting that, I mean, that is cruelty from the point of view of probably everyone except the person engaged in it, right. who is just sort of blindly moving, doing this thing.
And there's a pattern in that too. Just if I could just say really quickly that in terms of, like, in what folks are calling, like, white supremacy culture, this idea of, like, oh, let's talk about this little thing and who's to blame, as opposed to looking at inequalities and people mattering, right? And what is that from a moral standpoint? Yeah, Todd, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's going to lead us to questions of institutional change. But before we go there, I wanted to pick up, because Pamela's example in the classroom is good, because it's people are blaming each other, but you can imagine the move to cruelty. So a student posts somewhere about the professor that they're ugly, that they're just so boring that nobody would, you don't know how they ever were to be in a relationship with anybody. That's passing over into cruelty. But now to keep Pamela's distinction, you can do that without necessarily taking pleasure in it. The idea is, look, this person is somebody I can just say what I want about. Or you can do it, say, enjoying the act of doing it, and then it becomes not just cruelty, but sadistic cruelty.
Right. And it feels like it's almost like baked into our Constitution too. If you like looking at that 13th Amendment, that like, oh, nobody can be enslaved unless that's a punishment for a crime, right? That unless period feels like that little piece of exception that's like baked in as opportunity for cruelty, even in the text.
So yeah, and I let me add to that, because I do volunteer teaching in a local maximum security prison, and people will commit crimes. I mean, and then some fairly horrific crimes, and they will be there in these prisons for 30 or 40 or 50 years. People I've taught there, and one of the messages that sometimes the state legislatures try to give is, yeah, what we have to do with these folks is take away their educational opportunities, take away their physical facilities, because they've got to pay for what they've done. So this becomes an excuse for cruelty against people who, again, some of whom have committed terrible crimes. I often quote the great anti-death penalty lawyer Brian Stevenson, who says, everyone is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And when I go into the prisons and teach, and we talk philosophy, we talk about Aristotle and Rawls and whoever else, when we're doing philosophy together, they are being more than the worst thing they've ever done. Although when you reduce them to the worst thing they've ever done, you've seen them as somehow fundamentally different from you, and you've opened the door to cruelty to them.
Right. And I wanna turn a little bit to a question that we've gotten about from Karen, and I'm actually going to pop it up. And she's asking, is there a frame, going back to this idea of contractualism, where that which is good for most marginalized determines the moral norm? So can we determine by the people most at risk, the folks with the least power? What does that look like? And is there a frame for that?
So it's so there may be it won't exactly be contractualism, and that's because so contractualism is close to John Rawls's position. John Rawls's political theory does say that any inequality has to be justified with respect to the least well-off. So it gives a privileged spot to the least well-off. Contractualism as a moral theory treats everyone's interests equally. Right? Now, if you're marginalized, you're going to be in a position in which a lot of your interests have not been treated equally. And so you're going to have a ton of grounds for complaints. And so because of that, you might get a lot of attention because your interests have been treated so unequally. But it's not because we've made those interests more important. It's only because we've made them, because we're trying to treat all interests symmetrically, and these have, as things stand, been treated so unjustly that they come to the fore, and there may be need for restitution and all kinds of things. But unlike the political theory of John Rawls, where because it's dealing with economics, because of specific features of it picks out the position of the least well off, and that feature, this is all a little abstract and academic, but that feature gets lost in the contractualism. But not the attention to the people who are poorly off, because they're being poorly off is what we need to pay attention to.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And let me just add to that a bit. So when we're thinking about equality, we're thinking at that's at a fairly high level, right? I mean, Karen's question was really good. There's just one small change I would add, which is it's not that the folks who are marginalized get to dictate the moral norm, but they may get to dictate a moral norm, and that moral norm closer to the ground. So if we presuppose the equality of everyone and we're forming norms, there are going to be societies in which people are marginalized and treated unequally, and there may be moral norms that are specific in that society, closer to the ground, that we need to respond to because of the history and the context in which those norms are formed. So you can retain a broad contractualism and yet see nuances specifically on the ground because of the history and context of the development of that society. And I think this is one of the things. Yeah. So I think one of the things we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, and I've seen it before in other movements, is the idea, right, that there are moral norms that we need to respond to because of where we are.
Right, absolutely. And I think, and just calling attention to another comment. So Babs has said, we are cruel to poor people because we treat poverty as a moral failing. And this feels to me a little bit like the flip side of this like rags to riches narrative, like American, like coming back to this rugged individualism idea. Like you can get to the top if you want to, if you work hard enough. That kind of idea. Exactly. Like you don't assimilate fast enough. Can you speak a little bit to that sort of that moral norm in this American story? What is that? What can you say about that?
But Pamela, do you want? I was going to say something, but you want to jump in first? Okay.
No.
Right. So there's a history here as well. Look, the U.S. has had a more individualist orientation for decades, one might say centuries. But something's happened in the last 40 years that I think has changed and pressed on that individualism. If I were to give it a term, I would call it neoliberalism. So if we think of the standard neoliberal doctrine, people should have the maximum of freedom. The government is the problem. It's not the solution, that we get the government out of people's lives. One of the things that's gone along with that is a collapse, or if collapse is too strong a term, certainly a demeaning or a lessening of social solidarity. People are encouraged, you're on your own. Things go badly, we're not going to help you, right? And a lot of the legislation, by the way, that was passed about this was passed not under Republicans, but also under Democrats. And in the course of this, people, if you throw people back on themselves and they're trying to raise themselves by their own effort and they don't have a sense of collective solidarity with one another, boy, it becomes really easy to look at a person who's having a difficulty and saying, well, look, I made it, you didn't make it, and that must be your failing and not mine.
Well, and it comes to this idea also of not wanting to give something up, right? And we talk about inequities and not wanting to give away power, right? So there's kind of like power hoarding or money hoarding, and this is something that is certainly a confrontation with white people right now. Like, right, like I don't want to give up my safety, right? I don't want to give up what I have. Like, how do folks confront that moral quandary of like, what do you give up to make a more ethical, more moral, more equitable society?
And it's not just safety and wealth. I think a big thing that people don't want to give up is, again, their feeling of righteousness, right? They're feeling that they live in a just society, and that what they've achieved, is not unjust. Do people know about the Milgram experiments? There was.
Share more.
So I mean, it's a little roundabout, but these were experiments done in the 60s that you can't do this kind of thing anymore, where the psychologists had somebody that an actor who was pretending to receive electric shocks. And the test subject would come in and be told by a person in authority to give more, greater and greater shocks. And when they would try to stop, the person in authority would say something like, "You must continue the experiment," or something like that. Yeah. And what was distressing was how far people would go following the advice of the authority and continuing to deliver what to them they should believe are these extremely painful electric shocks to the subject. In fact, it's the actor, but for the person in the room, they think they're actually delivering these shocks. So I heard a lecture a long time ago about this experiment that I thought was really interesting. It suggested that the reason, there's lots of theories about why people do this, about authority and what have you, but this theory said, well, the problem is that at any point where you decide to stop, it's so gradual that you have to recognize that you've been doing something horrible for the last however long, right? And so rather than, accept that you've been in the wrong, you just sort of keep soldiering on, to kind of protect your own righteousness. And so I think that's also a piece of why people have a hard time sort of confronting our society right now, because I mean it's in a way it's similar to the 60s where the white consciousness of like, oh, everything's so wonderful, was shattered, and so too it seems to me that people are not wanting to acknowledge that their own that things aren't okay, and so that seems to me an important piece.
Yeah, and I think Pamela's touching on something really deep here about people, which is people like to feel that they're morally okay. But something about morality is deep enough in our identification with it that when we get confronted with something that may raise the question of whether we are morally okay or whether we've been morally okay in some way or another, that's very difficult for folks. And so they'll do a lot to shy away from that. What I so often tell my classes is people's ability knowingly to do evil is very limited. I mean, some people can pull it off, but it's very limited. But people's capacity for self-deception is almost infinite. And in the area of morality, this is where you see a lot of self-deception. And with various niche media now, it becomes easier to continue in the self-deception because your own righteousness is being reinforced. And one of the things that I think people have to confront now, particularly relative to Black Lives Matter, which we've been confronting it for generations, but confronting it now, is that you may think you know what's going on in the lives of Black folks, but you don't. And when I organize, which I have done in various arenas, one of the things you need to show up with is the recognition you don't know what's going on. You may think you know, but you don't, and so you got to learn and you got to ask questions. So my daughter, who lives in Chicago, who's been involved in a number of the protests, she's having long conversations with people, learning about things that she wouldn't have known if she hadn't opened herself up for it. But it's so easy in our society to do that, particularly when you have something as important as your own sense of your moral righteousness being threatened.
Right. And that circles back a little bit to thinking about goodness in relationship. And I want to highlight something, Todd, that you said. We were talking about this conversation yesterday, and you said the sentence that I wrote down that I think is just remarkably beautiful, which is, for us to be good is a collective project. And thinking about that in this moment and this power of like collective action and all of these things, could you both talk a little bit about how goodness is a collective effort, what that might look like beyond the norms we talked about earlier?
Good. And Pamela, you've in discussing this tied this nicely to the contractualism stuff as well.
Yeah. So what comes to my mind, I think I've said that there's a need for us to get along. There's a need for us to make room for individualism, for individual and competing ideas of what a good life is like, but then also to solve collective problems together and be willing to constrain our own pursuits with respect to those.
You also talked about the what you call it, the personal piety as opposed to collective. That was really interesting.
Okay, so thank you. So there's also, I think, a tendency in our culture to think that we're going to solve problems by what I think of as personal piety. So the example, my go-to example as someone who lives in California is the drought that we faced for years. And there was a lot of focus on individual consumer choices. So taking shorter showers, and the restaurants weren't supposed to put out water. And that's fine for, rallying the troops or something. But in fact, residential and personal use of water is like a drop in this bucket in terms of the agricultural and industrial uses. So there's a way in which thinking that you're going to solve the problem by personal piety can just be there's a way in which, big agro and the industry would love for you to think that that's the way to do it, because it's going to take the pressure off of them. So there's something about, and this is actually, I think, connected to the thread that was still in my head from the previous, for what we were just talking about poverty, which is, I think there's another really deep feature of human nature, in addition to wanting to feel like you're morally okay, which is, there's a really deep resistance to thinking that that there can be pain and suffering that you can't do anything about, right? Or that's not in your control, and so the personal piety thing has that going for it. Like, but there's a big problem, and of course, if we all just did the right thing, and if we kind of got on one another's case to do the right thing, that would fix it. But it could be that the fix is a level up. So another example of this was, there was on a Philosophers blog a number of years ago. I don't know if you all, when the airlines seats have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah. Then there were these devices you could get that would prevent the person in front of you from reclining. And so then there was this debate on this blog about whether it was okay to use this device, and people were very, upset about it on both sides. And I just thought, whoa, like here's the problem is one level up. Like, for us to be arguing amongst ourselves about this is silly. The problem is that the airlines have squished us into an impossibly small space. So dealing with it at this interpersonal level seemed like just to get off on the wrong foot to begin with.
And think, Elizabeth, about, as Pamela has described us, about how individualistic that thinking, the personal piety is. It sees society as a collection of individuals without seeing the structure elements, right? That are, as Pamela describes it, one step up. Was it Margaret Thatcher who said that there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families? And I see the same thing going on with the police. This few bad apples analysis sees the police as an aggregate of individuals, right, rather than as an institution that has a role to play in the society. And I wrote about that in the Stone recently with a colleague of mine, George Yancey, and we were arguing that the few bad apples way of thinking is conceptually a mistake, because what it does is it seems to reduce formal structures to the participation simply of individuals. And if, in as much as the police, let's say, are racist, they are racist not simply because there's a lot of individuals who are racist, right? They are racist because the function of the police, one of the central functions of the police in our society is to maintain the social hierarchy the way that it is, and to stop any threats to the way that social hierarchy exists now. And so what Pamela's talking about with personal piety is that individualistic way of thinking that we have to abandon if we're going to make the kinds of changes that we could say will grant us a healthy and a flourishing community.
Right. And that feels like also a way a contradiction in the point system, right? That is posed in the good place of like, you do this action, you get these points. You do this action, you get these points. And then it doesn't take into account the systems for ripple effects, right? That there's something, that they get to eventually in the show, and thinking about like what the ripple effects of buying a tomato at the supermarket is, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, that tomato was farmed by somebody who wasn't paid to do that farming. That tomato was farmed by an enslaved person. So my points are shot. And what are the ripple effects in systems, and how do we judge morality on an individual basis when there are systems of morality at play?
Yeah. So and that institutional. I mean, so I want to come back and say, on the other hand, I don't want to abandon personal piety. Right? No. I mean, there are things that there are problems that are meant to be solved by individual action. And we were talking about masks. All right, that's a thing that individuals have to make those decisions. But yeah, exactly, the issues that show up in the good place of what you're calling the ripple effects, those are precisely the kind of problems that need institutional solutions, and precisely the kind of problems that we can't collectively, we can't, as an aggregate of individuals, solve them. We need to organize ourselves into institutional roles and address things at that level. And that's, it's a classic problem in moral philosophy of how you bridge that gap, how it is that individual obligation generates institutions to start with.
Right, and it seems to me go ahead.
I think, coming back, Pam was saying that there's an interaction here at a practical level. There's an interaction. Mm-hmm. So if you're engaged in personal piety and don't see the structural problems, those structural problems are going to persist. But I've seen things the other way around as well. Working with people who say, look, it's all about structural change, and are not interested in their own sort of moral standing. And so they allow themselves things that will all the way up to the level of cruelty individually, because it's justified on the basis that, that will make structural change. So I think the two, the individual and the collective responsibility, at a practical level, right, reinforce each other. People who are sensitive to the collective problems are more likely to arrange their own personal actions a certain way, right? And people who are arranging their own personal actions a certain way can open themselves up, right, to the necessity for collective institutional change.
And it seems to me that there's also this in between, right? So there's this individual, like, what can I do by myself, and what can we do as institutions? But also there's this relational piece, which I think like circles back to that, like something that is really beautiful in the show about goodness developing through relationship, right? Like how that happens through how can we make one another good? And I think that could you talk a little bit about the step between personal piety and institutional change? What are those things that can happen in relationship to manifest or create or cultivate goodness and good lives?
Yeah, one of the things that this goes back to for Mike Schur is he grounded some of this stuff in Aristotle's ethics. And so for Aristotle, becoming a good person was not something that one did outside of the social surroundings one was in. At one point, at the beginning of the ethics, I think he says, Pamela, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he says that ethics is a branch of politics. So that our individual behavior, right, is something that is inseparable from the kinds of social and political conditions that we're in. And so becoming a good person is something that happens in the course of your relationships with one another. This goes back to Aristotle. I should mention briefly that this is something that's also been brought up more recently by a number of feminist theorists who are very good at seeing the necessity of connection in order to do morality, rather than seeing it as something that's abstract and purely rational. But the difference in The Good Place from Aristotle is that for Aristotle, it was important that your teachers be people who had lots of virtue. And one of the things I love about The Good Place is that it shows how deeply flawed people can make one another better in their relationships with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's it's another point at which the point system, it's a thing I liked about the way the story developed, is that the limit of the point system, the motivational limits of the point system show up. Eleanor in season 2, she's trying to make herself a better person, and she's trying to think about the effect she's having, and essentially in a kind of point system sort of way, and she runs out of steam, right? She just runs out of gas doing that.
Yeah.
And she starts to find it again. Well, first, actually, when she hears the contractualism story from the lecture that Chidi's giving about where and it's not always recognized, but the centerpiece of contractualism is a desire to live in a certain kind of relationship with other people, namely a relationship in which each of us recognizes the other as somebody who recognizes us with respect. Right, so mutual recognition of mutual respect is kind of being able to look people in the eye. Right, that's the kind of core ideal of the theory, and then Eleanor gets drawn into then friendships with, with this group of people in the show, and now going back to season 1, when she is out in the middle place. What do they call it? The middle place?
I think it's a medium place.
Oh,
The
yeah,
medium place.
Okay.
The medium place with Mindy, right?
Yes.
She's in the medium place, and she's like, no, we got to go back and help our friends, right? We gotta, we owe it to them, right? So there's that kind of initial sense of, the connection there between justice and friendship is pretty vivid, and so and the way in which, the points, there's things that generate a lot of good, but don't generate that kind of relationship, right? Tahini's kind of like that. She's like generating a lot of good things, but she's not getting or it takes her a while, to get the importance of the relationships.
And I want to just highlight something you just said about the relationship between friendship and justice being really strong, and that feels like it has echoes that go beyond that moment in the story, for sure. But Todd, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please go ahead.
No. This actually was just a complete side note, because I was thinking about the medium place, and one of the characteristics of the medium place is the beer is warm, and I thought, oh, England is the medium place. That must be what they're
That's amazing. Is the beer all warm in England? Is that a thing?
No, that's a thing. It's that they serve particularly the bitter.
They like
the
it
bitter
that way.
is meant to be warm. See, yeah.
I'm learning so much. Morality and otherwise, I love it.
So Elizabeth's going to walk away from here and like a week from now, what was it like? What I know is that the beer is warm in England.
Lessons learned. Listen, we are an international festival. We've got to have perspectives from all over. So I think in terms of like building goodness, like how do we cultivate good? Like we talk about being good, or like what the lowest bar is, right? The lowest bar of goodness, or living a good life, or cultivating good with one another. Are there places where you see we should look to, or places where you see that happening? Like what are things that are giving you that sense of good right now?
So like I said, the thing that I think got Mike's attention on my website was this paper about, at one point it was called Why You Can't Be Good by Trying. And the thought is, if you need to be a better person, it's because you lack good motives, that it's something about your motivation. But, and Aristotle says, and it's good advice, I don't mean to say it's bad advice, but Aristotle says if you need to be a better person, do what the good person does. So basically, fake it till you make it, right? Like imitate the good person until you become a good person. But what's weird about this, what's puzzling about this is that, I mean, motives aren't like muscles. It's not like repetition makes them stronger or something, right? Like, so in order to, so if practice makes perfect, why wouldn't you just become a great faker, right? Like, why wouldn't you just become really good at imitating the virtuous person? It seems like something has to happen that changes you. Something has to happen so that your motives shift. And that shift, I think, isn't just effort, despite the fact that Mike loves to say trying. And I don't mean to be disparaging the goodness of trying. But mere effort is not going to get you there without openness, right? Without a kind of openness to learning. So it is what I would say. So going back to when Todd was talking about his daughter, just listening, just being open to other people's experiences, being open to seeing things a new way, being open to thinking maybe I'm not so great, or maybe this wasn't, something I merited by my own bootstraps. Or maybe I'm not giving myself enough credit. Maybe I actually should be taking more credit for something. All of these things seem to me a kind of, yeah. So my brief would be for a kind of openness and learning. Of course, I'm an educator.
Yeah, because if moral thinking has no role, we're getting paid for nothing.
Yeah.
But I think there's another aspect to what Pamela is talking about as well. So when you try things, go back to what we said a bit ago about the idea that people identify with their morality, right? That they like to see themselves as okay. And if you're doing things, you think, like, this is the okay thing to do, right? I'm doing this, right? This thing which is not inside me yet, but I'm doing this because this is the okay thing to do. I think that can sometimes help lead to, not all by itself, but help lead to a sense of, well, I guess this is my morality. Let me start acting and identifying with this way of being. So that I want to see the outside and the inside, and I'm not saying Pamela denies, but I want to see the outside and inside is potentially more porous. That the kinds of things that you do develop these habits. Aristotle was big on habits, develop habits. But the next step is that if you're identifying with those habits, you're identifying with a way of being that you begin to see yourself as, right? And it involves training, and it involves this openness, which I think Pamela's exactly right. You have to move out of your niche and see. That's what the openness is, right? To see where other people are, to see what their lives are like, to see what their experiences are. And as you do that, as you open yourself, you can, I think, then begin to modify your own behavior in ways that you then identify with, and gradually that becomes you. I remember when I was doing some organizing in the African American community, one point there was a big meeting. I won't get into the details of it, but there were some white fraternity people on campus who were just not hearing what the African Americans were saying on campus. I didn't want to jump in because I thought I shouldn't be speaking for the African Americans. I'm just going to let them do that. They knew me, and they came up to me after and said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I said, "Well, I didn't want to speak for you. I just thought it would be unfair to speak for you." And they said, "Well, don't you think we ever get tired of speaking for ourselves? Maybe you could jump in and help." And I thought, okay, there's something I didn't know, right? That's a nuance in my relationship to working alongside these folks that I just hadn't recognized. But I needed to take that on board and then figure out now, okay, when do I speak and when do I shut up?
That's such an important piece of learning that I think feels constant. And I want to take a moment just to invite folks who are watching that, like, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to include as many of your questions as possible. So please, by all means, put those in. And this is something that I think you were both sort of getting at in terms of goodness output too, that I want to circle back to something in the show about this idea of like a happiness pump, right? There's this guy, Doug Forsett, in the show, for folks who haven't seen it, who is like, oh, I have to do all the good things for the points. And he winds up literally just drinking his own refiltered urine as water, and only eating mushrooms and lentils and trying to have a zero carbon foot. And he's done all of this extension, really personal piety to the extreme, right? And is kind of miserable. And there's this sort of oh, I gotta do this. Could you all speak to that idea a little bit of this constant output, and why is that not good?
Well, for one thing, it's a recipe for burnout. Right. That if you're constantly putting that pressure on yourself to be better in every element or aspect of your life, then it's easy just to eventually get alienated from your own life, right? And your own commitments and engagements. And one of the traditional criticisms of utilitarianism, which is the kind of thing that Doug Forsett was on about, is that its demands are unceasing. You're constantly having to be, there's always something you can do to make the world better. Right. And so I think that if we, in one area, if we're talking about political organizing, right, when I work with people on this, what I tell them is, look, pick the issue you're going to make better, and pick how much time you're going to spend on that, and commit yourself to that. So you don't have to, every time Trump puts some outrage down the pike, right, you don't have to drop everything and respond to that. Right? Figure out how to make yourself better, and figure out how to do something X amount of hours every week. And that's the way in which you can make society better without getting to yourself to the point where you're just alienated from your own life, really.
Right. Pamela, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm trying to collect my thoughts. I mean, I think I have a couple different thoughts about Doug Forsett. One is that he's he's trying to solve problems that need institutional solutions, but that's not the main issue with Doug. It's something like thinking of morality as performance, is maybe what I want to put it. Like thinking of So I have a paper whose title I am unreasonably pleased with. The title of my paper is "I'll Bet You Think This Blame Is About You." So
that's a good title.
It's drawing on the I'm way too pleased with it. It's drawing on the Carly Simon song "You're So Vain, I'll Bet You Think This Song Is About You." And most people, it's a very catchy song. A lot of times people think that that part of the hook of it is that it how can it not be about this guy? It talks about his Lear jet. It talks about his yacht. I mean, the whole song is about this guy. And then she turns around and says, it's not about him. Like, what's going on? And who is it really about? Is it Warren Beatty? Is it Mick Jagger? Like, what's going on with this song? And who's this guy? Right. And in fact, the point of the song, I take it, is that it's not about him at all. It's about her, right? The song is about her and her experience, or about the women who have been womanized by these men. And so if you think that this is about you, you're so vain. Like, how is this about you? And there's a way in which the point system can be individualistic in that way. Like I'm performing, I'm generating, I'm doing, whereas, what I want to say is that if you are thinking that your moral failing, so if you're an Olympic athlete and you have dedicated your life and hours of every day to your sport and its beauty and its drama and everything else, and you go out on the Olympic stage and you screw it up, like you fail, and you experience this tremendous disappointment in yourself, disappointment against this ideal, right? All of that. I want to say, like, if that's how you feel when you have disrespected another person, like you just failed against this super important standard, that you are missing out, right? I mean, you are missing the most important thing about your situation, which is the other person who you just disrespected, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something of that about Doug Forsett, something about like the focus on his own performance instead of missing out on the fact that, I mean, all of us, the fact that any of us have failed morally, I want to say, is like kind of the most boring fact there is, right? Like, why is that an interesting fact? The other people and their value that we have, that we've taken a chunk out of, that's an important fact. Like, that chunk needs to, be healed back up. But the fact that we screwed up isn't, like, that's not very interesting. Or the fact that we achieved, also not very, I mean, so Doug Forsett, like, not very interesting.
Right. He lives such a boring life. That's one of the things that's so remarkable, is like, is that what goodness looks like? Is it boring? And that's, I think, and turning, we have two questions from the audience I want to touch on.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize, please. The one is thinking about Chidi, and the reason he's in the bad place is this crippling indecision. This is a question from Gina. So hello, Gina. Thank you. And that it's, albeit unintentionally, his indecision harms other people. And it's kind of like a crippling anxiety. And the question is it immoral to have that kind of anxiety? Is that kind of indecision somehow immoral? Is it kind of a judgment on mental health issues? Like, what is that? Where do you feel like that is coming from, in terms of Chidi's morality?
So one thing it's coming from is the fact that every philosopher, Todd may disagree with me about this, but it is in fact a professional danger to be. I mean, it's so common. Like, the last, I think I told Mike in our first meeting, like, the last thing you want to do is stand around at a philosophy conference at lunch trying to figure out where to go, because nobody can make a decision about where to go to lunch.
Is that true, Todd?
No, I think that's true. I think that I think one might go further. And sometimes just the standing around at a philosophy conference can be problematic.
That's true too. So is it a vice to be indecisive or to be risk averse? No, I don't think it's a vice. Does it become problematic when it starts to impinge on other people's well-being? Sure, yeah, it does become problematic there. And part of Chidi's issue is that he's so worried about, about whether he's going to do, I mean, it hooks up with the thing I was just talking about. He's so worried about whether he does something wrong, that he's missing out on what's happening right in front of him sometimes.
Yeah, and there's also, philosophically, there is a kind of parody of a certain kind of Kant and Kant deontology there. So he's constantly looking for the right principle. Okay, what's the principle? And in critiques of Kant, right, one of the questions that comes up is, well, how actually do you formulate the principle that you're supposed to act on deontologically? And Chidi is a guy who every principle he formulates, he can see another principle, right, that might work just as well to take him in the opposite direction. So philosophically, he's stuck. And this is I would say, for those with fewer sympathies to a traditional Kantian picture, this is going to be a source of amusement.
Right. And I want to tap into this next question, just thinking about, like, how do we use the study of morality to inform choices? Like, when do we speak? When do we listen? How do we, like, what is the relationship between the study of morality and behavior? How can we take what we're learning today as we're starting to come to a close, like, and move it to action?
Well, I would just say email Pamela and ask what you should do, and she'll just tell you.
Read Miss Manners. No,
Pamela, you want to take a whack at that one? That's a big question.
Yeah, I can try. I can try. I mean, I think that thinking about moral theory, which is what I've spent my life doing, does help you in sort of knowing certain joints and certain distinctions and kind of thinking through difficult questions in a certain way. But I don't think it gives me a massive leg up on ordinary life. I mean, I think when to speak and when to listen, that's a matter of paying attention, careful attention to the people around you, and also to yourself, and also, you know, trusting yourself in a certain way, and giving yourself a little slack to try it out and see when to speak and when to listen, and trying to make sure that other people can tell you when you've spoken too much or not spoken enough, like Todd was saying, and that you're open to the feedback, and open to change. And I mean, so that's means yeah. I'll stop.
Yeah, it doesn't all come from books. Yeah.
Well, and I would add to this, and I think Pamela probably would be comfortable with this. I think what moral philosophy can give us is a space and tools to reflect, to step back from the immediacy of our engagements and to ask ourselves questions. And if we think of these moral theories as tools we can use to ask, you know, okay, what are the effects of my action? What am I intending? What kind of person am I becoming? If we think of them as reflective tools, that can help to foster the openness that Pamela was talking about earlier, that's become a theme in the discussion, so that rather than being immediately tied to our own reaction, we can step back and reflect. And I think one of the things that moral philosophy has helped me to do is step back from the immediacy of the kinds of things that I would normally judge about, and ask myself, well, am I right about that? Is that maybe there's another way to look at this? And I think moral philosophy can be helpful that way.
That's really beautiful. I think the moment for a pause can be hard to remember. And we are coming to the end of our time together. I could talk to you all for hours and hours. And I want to steal a closing question from actually the Good Place podcast, which is hosted by Mark Evan Jackson. And I really love the way he ends it. He just asks folks, "What's good?" As we're leaving, can you give us something good to head off with? What is good?
So I'll take a quick one. There are obvious things, you know, justice, peace. These are obvious things. And so on a sort of more mundane note, let me just suggest to folks that a really well-made old-fashioned, it's good.
That is good.
Great.
a really well-made one. That's a little bit of goodness.
I love it. Pamela, how about you?
What's good? So an idea that I think we need to spend more time with is grace. The idea of giving one another grace and space. What's sunshiny 70-degree day is good.
That sounds really good. And this has been good. Thank you so much for spending the time. Thank you, everybody, for watching and for making this festival good and for the goodness you bring to the world every day. Big thank you to everybody. And for folks watching, this is the end of our ideas series for this year. And we'll have, you can still watch all the things from the past 8 weeks or so. And there's still a few events coming up this weekend. Please, though, let us know what you think. Let us know what's on your mind. You can go to artidea.org/survey, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Todd.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.